In late September 1982, a shocking crime spree in the Chicago area left 7 people dead after they unwittingly consumed Tylenol painkillers laced with deadly potassium cyanide. The victims ranged in age from 12-year-old Mary Kellerman to 35-year-old Paula Prince, all who collapsed suddenly after taking what they thought was ordinary extra-strength Tylenol. The mysterious poisoning deaths triggered nationwide fear, a massive product recall, and one of the largest investigations in American history. On the morning of September 29, 1982, news began to spread that several people in the Chicago area had mysteriously died after taking Tylenol. Mary Kellerman, age 12, had been rushed to the hospital the day before with a sudden illness and died after taking Tylenol for a cold. That same day, Adam Janus, 27, also passed away, again after taking the medication. Tragically, Adam's brother Stanley Janus, 25, and sister-in-law Teresa Janus, 20, died soon after, all having taken pills from the same Tylenol bottle at Adam's home. Within a short span, Mary Reiner, 27, Mary McFarland, 31, and Paula Prince, 35, also fell victim to cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. In total, at least 7 people lost their lives in the Chicago area before authorities recognized the common link. Local officials and medical professionals acted swiftly once the connection to Tylenol was suspected. A nurse named Helen Jensen played a key early role. She visited the Janus family home, noted their Tylenol bottle had been recently purchased and had 6 pills missing, and alerted investigators that the painkillers might be the cause. A Cook County medical examiner, hearing this information, had a hunch the culprit was cyanide and told the investigators it emits an almond odor. Investigators opened a suspicious Tylenol capsule and detected the almond-like smell, and lab tests soon confirmed that several Tylenol capsules contained potassium cyanide, a fast-acting poison. This rapid forensic discovery, essentially basic toxicology and keen observation, was crucial in preventing many more deaths. Authorities immediately held a press conference to warn the public not to consume any Tylenol products for the time being. The response from both government and the manufacturer was sweeping. Within days, Johnson & Johnson issued an urgent product recall. The recall was initially focused on the suspected lot of Tylenol capsules and then rapidly expanded to all Tylenol extra-strength capsules in the Chicago area. As more tainted bottles were found across different stores and even different Tylenol lot numbers, the recall widened to eventually include 31 million bottles of Tylenol nationwide. The company halted all Tylenol production and advertising, and it instructed consumers nationwide to avoid Tylenol capsules until the scope of the tampering could be determined. This quick action and clear warnings are often credited with preventing further loss of life. By early October, Tylenol had been completely pulled off store shelves, and law enforcement agencies at every level were mobilized to hunt for the person, or persons, responsible. The investigation into the Tylenol case became a massive, multi-agency effort involving local police departments, the Illinois State Police, the FBI, and the FDA. Early forensic evidence pointed to how the crime was committed. The poisoned Tylenol capsules came from different production plants. This meant it was highly unlikely the tampering occurred during manufacturing, a fact which greatly limited the geographic scope of the investigation. Instead, police hypothesized that the perpetrator purchased several bottles of Tylenol from various stores around Chicago. The perpetrator is then thought to have added cyanide to some of the capsules, and then returned the resealed bottles to store shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy. This theory fit the scattered geography of the incidents, as tainted bottles were found at multiple pharmacies and grocery stores in the Chicago area. It also explained why only certain bottles were deadly, rather than entire production lots. It also meant the perpetrator had to physically visit those stores in the days or weeks prior to the deaths, which gave investigators a rough timeline and locations to scrutinize. With no immediate suspect, investigators turned to both old-fashioned police work as well as some new innovative tactics. Chicago police and the FBI conducted countless interviews and followed up on leads about anyone buying or possessing cyanide. At the FBI's suggestion, an unusual sting operation was attempted in early 1983. Columnist Bob Greene of the Chicago Tribune published a story with the home address and graveyard location of Mary Kellerman, the youngest victim. The idea was to provoke the perpetrator into visiting either the family's home or the gravesite, perhaps out of guilt or twisted curiosity. Both locations were placed under 24-hour video surveillance for months, but the suspect never showed up. Investigators also released to the media a surveillance photo from a drugstore security camera that showed victim Paula Prince buying her Tylenol. In the background of the photo, a mysterious bearded man is seen watching her. Police publicly labeled that unknown bearded man as a possible suspect, hoping someone might identify him. Others have observed that Paula Prince was a conventionally attractive young woman who likely attracted unwanted stares and gazes fairly routinely. Despite these efforts, the man was never identified. A major early break in the investigation was the emergence of a prime suspect through an unexpected source, an extortion letter. On October 1st, 1982, Johnson & Johnson received a letter from someone claiming responsibility for the poisonings and demanding $1 million to stop the carnage. Law enforcement treated the letter seriously and traced it to a man named James William Lewis, a 36-year-old who had once lived in the Chicago area. Lewis quickly became the focus of the investigation. A nationwide manhunt ensued, and Lewis, along with his wife Leanne, was eventually arrested in New York City in December 1982. With Lewis in custody, investigators hoped they had their man. Lewis didn't emerge from nowhere, and he had a checkered past that drew law enforcement attention even before the Tylenol case. Born in Missouri, Lewis worked as an accountant in the 1970s. In 1978, he was charged in Kansas City with the slaying of a 72-year-old client, Raymond West. Lewis was suspected of the crime after fingerprints, later identified as his, were found on some evidence. However, the charges were later dismissed as some evidence had been obtained illegally, undermining the case. This meant Lewis walked free, but the incident established his history of serious run-ins with the law. By the early 1980s, James and his wife Leanne had spent time in Chicago, and Lewis had also been accused of fraud, for which the couple reportedly fled the area prior to the Tylenol incidents. But let's get back to the extortion letter itself for a moment. The author of the letter claimed responsibility for the 7 deaths and instructed that the money be deposited in a particular bank account. Investigators traced the bank account to a Chicago bank and discovered it belonged to a former employer of James Lewis's wife. Lewis later admitted he wrote the letter, saying he never intended to collect any money himself. Rather, he wanted to direct suspicion toward his wife's former boss by having the money sent to that person's account. In other words, Lewis claimed the extortion attempt was a hoax, a way to frame someone else out of vindictiveness, rather than an admission that he was actually the Tylenol poisoner. Now let me just take a moment here to discuss my own theory. If he was the one responsible, he may have planned on doing some form of violence to his former wife's boss to get access to that money. After all, if this former employer was to disappear after withdrawing the cash, investigators would have had to investigate the possibility that he left the country with the money. Notably, this also provided plausible deniability to a much lesser crime should he be caught. In essence, I think it may have been a scheme to strike it rich, with a built-in insurance policy that potentially allowed him to escape responsibility for the truly horrific poisoning crimes. Upon arrest, Lewis didn't confess to the poisonings. However, he did do something rather intriguing. He gave investigators a detailed account of how theoretically the perp might have carried out the poisonings. Anyway, for reasons that should be obvious to everyone watching, I'm not going to go into the details he provided to the authorities. That said, in essence, he gave them a tutorial on how to tamper with the bottles without anyone noticing. Of course, this was all conjecture according to him, and not in any way tied to reality. Authorities later found that he also owned a book which contained instructions for manufacturing poisons, which I'm sure he claimed was just reference material. Adding to suspicion, his fingerprints were very lightly found throughout the book, except in one area, the cyanide part. Despite all this, investigators never found enough evidence to actually bring charges directly in relation to the Tylenol tamperings. They were, however, able to prosecute him for the crime related to the letter itself. In 1983, Lewis was put on trial in federal court for attempting to extort $1 million from Johnson & Johnson by threatening further violence. During the trial, his defense team repeated Lewis's claim that he only wrote the letter to draw attention to someone else, his wife's ex-employer, and never intended to harm anyone. This claim didn't exonerate him in the eyes of the court for the act of sending the threat, which seems rather unsurprising to me. He was convicted of extortion and received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison. It's worth noting that throughout his imprisonment, and indeed for the rest of his life, James Lewis steadfastly maintained that he was not the Tylenol tamperer. He remains the only person to have ever been convicted in relation to the case. Another suspect investigated in relation to the case was Roger Arnold, a local dock worker. Arnold had allegedly bragged about having cyanide and made suspicious comments about his involvement while drinking at a bar. Police learned that Arnold worked with the father of one of the victims, Mary Reiner, which tied him to the case. Investigators detained Arnold for questioning multiple times, but they never found enough evidence to charge him in relation to the poisonings. In the 2010s, after both Lewis and Arnold had passed, their DNA was tested against potential DNA of the perpetrator found on one or some of the bottles. Unfortunately, since this is an active and ongoing investigation, the authorities haven't released whether the same person's DNA was found on all the bottles. Indeed, if the same DNA was found on 2 or more bottles, it appears to me to be extremely likely that that DNA is definitely that of the perpetrator. While the perpetrator still hasn't been caught, I'm somewhat confident that genetic genealogy may one day crack the case, depending on the nature of the DNA evidence on the bottles. Also, as a side note, the seals we crack on a new medication bottle are a direct result of this tragedy. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit that notification bell and share this video with 2 people you know. Sharing my videos with your friends and family and on your socials is the best way you can help my channel grow, and the best part is it's entirely free. In February 1998, a 20-year-old Canadian college student named Stephen Vincent Milan vanished under puzzling circumstances. What began as a late-night drive from his home in Mississauga, Ontario, turned into a cross-border mystery when his car was discovered over 2,000 miles away in Arizona. Stephen Milan was a business student at Humber College's North Campus in Toronto and lived with his family in Mississauga. On the night of February 13th, 1998, just after midnight, he left home driving his black 1991 Chevrolet Beretta. He had recently told relatives that he wanted to travel to the United States to obtain a medication for hair loss. At the time, a new prescription hair loss drug had just come on the market in the US, which may explain his interest in a cross-border trip. Whatever his true intentions, Stephen drove off alone that night and was never seen or heard from again. The first clue in Stephen's disappearance came at the US-Canada border. American customs records showed that his vehicle crossed into the United States at the Rainbow Bridge border crossing at Niagara Falls on February 14th, 1998. Notably, this was the day after he left home, and the drive from Mississauga to Niagara Falls only takes about an hour. Importantly, it hasn't been confirmed that Stephen himself was in the car at that time. No witnesses recalled seeing him, and the border log simply noted the car's license plate, not the occupants of the vehicle. When he failed to return or contact his family, they reported him missing to the Peel Regional Police in Ontario. Investigators now had an international missing person case on their hands, with the last trace of Stephen being his car's entry into the States. From the outset, law enforcement treated Stephen's disappearance as unusual. Peel Regional Police began a missing person investigation and reached out to U.S. authorities once the border crossing was discovered. For a time, there were no further leads on Stephen's whereabouts. Then, in a startling development, his car was found abandoned in Arizona only days after he went missing. According to reports, a local spotted Stephen's black Chevy parked at an overlook at the Grand Canyon sometime in mid-February. The car's keys were still in the ignition, and there was no sign of the driver. Rather than immediately notify police, the man who found the empty car decided to take it for himself and use it. He drove Stephen's vehicle around northern Arizona for a few months. Eventually, the car broke down, and he left it parked off State Route 64 near Flagstaff. On June 8, 1998, nearly 4 months after Stephen's disappearance, authorities finally recovered the car. It was found stripped of parts and abandoned off the highway in Flagstaff, roughly an hour's drive from where it had originally been spotted at the Grand Canyon overlook. When police traced the vehicle identification and plate, they realized it belonged to the missing Canadian student. American law enforcement interviewed the individual who had taken the car. He readily admitted he stumbled upon the empty vehicle at the Grand Canyon overlook and kept it, but claimed to know nothing about Stephen's fate. This person's actions were both illegal and highly unusual. As many internet sleuths have noted, finding a car with the keys in it and simply deciding to steal it is a bizarre twist in an already strange case. That said, there was no evidence linking the car thief to Stephen, aside from the vehicle itself. With the location of Stephen's car pinpointed, a coordinated search effort was launched in the area. The spot where the car had initially been found, the remote Little Colorado Gorge overlook located on Navajo land, was searched extensively on foot and by helicopter. Searchers scoured the canyon rim and the rugged terrain below for any trace of the missing student. Despite these extensive ground and aerial searches, no sign of Stephen was found. The Peel Regional Police completed their standard investigation steps and continued to monitor the case, but by the end of 1998, there were no solid clues pointing to what happened. One theory is that Stephen traveled all the way to northern Arizona and met with an accident near the canyon. The fact that his keys were left in the ignition suggests he may have stopped briefly and intended to return. It's possible he ventured near the canyon's edge and suffered a fall. However, an intensive search of the area below the overlook turned up no indication of his whereabouts. If he did fall into the canyon, one would expect some evidence to be discovered, but nothing was found. Another variant of this theory suggests that he may have gone down the gorge willingly, but again, this runs into the same evidentiary issues. To this day, there is no proof that Stephen's remains are in the Grand Canyon, leaving this theory unconfirmed. Another possibility is that Stephen encountered foul play after arriving at the Grand Canyon. The remote location where his car was abandoned could have made him vulnerable to a robbery or attack. Perhaps he crossed paths with the wrong person and met with violence, after which the perpetrator left his car with the keys inside to cover their tracks. No signs of a struggle were reported in the vehicle, but without proper forensic evidence, I don't see how the authorities could possibly rule this out. And I think it's important to remember here that the vehicle was used for months, and we really have no idea what happened with it during that time. If there were signs of a struggle, it's always possible that the car thief, even if he wasn't actually involved in any more serious criminal act, had the car cleaned up. After all, he clearly intended to treat it as his vehicle at least for a little while. If there was evidence of a crime in a stolen vehicle he was driving around, I imagine this could have been slightly problematic for him if he was pulled over with his Canadian plates on. Another theory turns on questioning whether the hair loss medicine was just a cover story for a different purpose. It struck many as unlikely that a college student would drive deep into the United States just to buy a hair loss product. Arizona's a very long way from the Canadian border, and he could have been in Buffalo in upstate New York in about an hour's drive from Mississauga. And just to give some perspective on this isn't just a long drive, but a road trip of a lifetime, which would take approximately 32 hours if you were traveling in the most efficient way. And to be clear, the most efficient way to Arizona from Mississauga isn't through New York State, but rather through the border crossing at Detroit, adding another layer of strangeness. These factors have led to speculation that Stephen might have had an ulterior motive for his journey. It's conceivable he had arranged to meet someone, perhaps someone he met online in a chat room, given the late 1990s timing, and didn't want to tell his family the real reason for his trip. At this point, people were meeting online through chat rooms, though this was still a highly stigmatized way to meet people at that point. If Stephen was secretly headed to meet a person, some speculate that he may have been set up. Notably, his vehicle was seen crossing the border into the United States on Valentine's Day, which adds a layer of circumstantial credibility to this theory. This theory, however, is purely speculative, and given that it was 1998, it looks as though the police never even investigated what was on his computer. Another theory which Stephen's family has promoted throughout the years is that he may not have left Canada at all. That said, there's been no evidence whatsoever to suggest that he met his end anywhere in Canada either. Further, if there was foul play in Canada, I question why the criminal would take the risk of moving the car into the States. Border security was very loose before 2001, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there at all. And a border crossing is a massive added risk for a criminal. This is a case where all theories have good evidence in their favor, but where no theory fits all the facts neatly, and crucial pieces of evidence remain missing. That said, I do think this case has a good chance of being solved one day. There are tens of thousands of John Does out there waiting to be identified by the genetic genealogy revolution, and Stephen could be identified any day now. The liar paradox is a classic logical puzzle that arises from a sentence that refers to its own truth in a contradictory way. The simplest example is the sentence, "This sentence is false." At first glance, it seems innocuous, but trying to decide whether this sentence is true or false leads to a problem. If the sentence, quote, "This sentence is false," is true, then what it says must hold, meaning the sentence is false, which is a contradiction. On the other hand, if the sentence is false, then it is not the case that the sentence is false, meaning the sentence would actually be true, another contradiction. In either case, the statement cannot consistently be labeled true or false. It in effect says, "I am false," creating a loop in which truth and falsehood flip endlessly. Thus, the liar paradox leaves us with a statement that seems to be neither true nor false under the usual rules of logic. This simple, self-referential conundrum has puzzled thinkers for over 2 millennia, and experts have never reached a consensus on a definitive solution. The paradox is more than a linguistic joke. It exposes fundamental questions about truth and consistency in language and logic. The liar paradox has a long history. It's sometimes also called the Epimenides paradox, after a story from around the 6th century BC. Epimenides of Crete, an early philosopher, is reputed to have declared that all Cretans are liars always. Since Epimenides himself was a Cretan, his statement indirectly refers to itself. If all Cretans always lie, then his statement would be a lie, implying not all Cretans lie always, which in turn could make his statement true after all. A more direct formulation was given by the Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus in the 4th century BC. Eubulides, a contemporary of Aristotle, proposed a thought experiment where a man says he is lying. Eubulides then asks if the man's statement is true or false. This is essentially the liar paradox in plain language. If the man's statement is true, then he is telling the truth about lying, meaning he is actually lying, which contradicts the initial assumption of truth. If instead his statement is false, then the man is lying as he says, which means his claim, "I am lying," is true. Again, a contradiction. From early on, the liar paradox challenged basic logical principles. Aristotle formulated the law of non-contradiction, which says that no statement can be both true and false at the same time, creating a bedrock principle of rational thought. Yet the liar paradox seems to violate this law by forcing itself to be true if it's false and false if it's true. The Greek philosophers who discussed the liar paradox didn't conclude that language itself was broken. Rather, they found that something in our reasoning about such self-referential statements was leading to inconsistency. In the 20th century, the liar paradox became a central topic in logic and the philosophy of language, spurring the development of formal theories of truth. A breakthrough came from Polish logician Alfred Tarski, who analyzed the liar paradox while working on a formal definition of truth. Tarski showed in 1936 that any logical language powerful enough cannot consistently contain a truth predicate that refers to its own sentences. And as a quick aside, a truth predicate is a function that, when you plug in a statement, gives you a true or false output based on the rules of the logical system. In other words, you cannot have a single language in which you can freely say, "This sentence is true," or "This sentence is false," about sentences of that very language. His proposal was to avoid paradox by introducing a hierarchy of languages, a base object language in which statements are made, and a separate meta-language at a higher level. For example, a sentence in the meta-language can declare a sentence in the object language to be true or false, but no sentence is allowed to assert its own truth or falsity. This strategy avoids self-reference of the problematic kind. Tarski's insight, known as Tarski's undefinability theorem, essentially states that a consistent system cannot contain a mechanism to declare its own statements true or false globally. That said, while some have accepted that this solves the liar's paradox, others have proposed that it simply sidesteps the problem. After all, to truly end this problem, you would have to get into an endless recursion of meta-languages, which creates another host of problems all by itself. Anyway, despite the apparent simple nature of the liar paradox, it's become a cornerstone of logical reasoning, with no universally accepted solution. In the summer of 1993, 43-year-old Michael Hare vanished under puzzling circumstances from Bonner County, Idaho. On June 19, 1993, Hare had a heated argument with his wife at their home. In the midst of the dispute, he stormed out of the house in anger and never returned. When Hare failed to come back or contact anyone, his family grew concerned and reported him missing. Local law enforcement with the Bonner County Sheriff's Office treated the incident as a missing person case and began investigating, searching for any signs of Hare's whereabouts. Initially, there was little to go on. Hare had simply disappeared without a trace. In the immediate aftermath, deputies and detectives followed standard procedures. They interviewed Hare's wife and relatives, checked the areas he was known to frequent, and looked for any signs of an accident or voluntary departure. As weeks turned into months with no word from Hare, investigators began to suspect that more was at play than an angry husband cooling off. The fact that Hare had never been heard from again signaled that his disappearance was likely not voluntary. About a year after Hare went missing, a significant lead emerged. An informant came forward in 1994 with a startling story. According to this source, Michael Hare had not simply wandered off, but had been shot and then disposed of in a kiln. The reason given by the informant was that Hare allegedly knew about a secret grow-op and was slain to keep him silent. They looked for anyone in Hare's circle who might be involved in illegal substance activity and landed upon Jim Montz, Hare's stepson. Investigators learned that Montz had a history with substances, and they suspected he might be running a street cabbage farming operation. In September 1994, acting on the informant's tip, Bonner County deputies and Idaho State Police officers executed a search warrant on Montz's rural property. What they uncovered was indeed a sophisticated enterprise. Montz had an underground bunker concealing roughly 80 plants, complete with high-end cultivation equipment. The discovery confirmed a major part of the informant's story. During the raid, officers also noticed something else that sent a jolt through the investigative team. A large kiln was discovered on the property, just like the informant said it would be. This was exactly the type of oven the informant had described as being used to cremate Hare's body. The presence of the kiln gave investigators both a possible crime scene and physical evidence to scrutinize. Montz was arrested at the scene on substance manufacturing charges. With Montz in custody, law enforcement turned their attention to gathering physical evidence that could confirm what happened to Michael Hare. The kiln found on Montz's property became the focus of a painstaking forensic search. Investigators sifted through the ashes and debris inside the kiln, looking for any trace of human remains that might have survived high-temperature burning. Indeed, they did find some bones amid the ashes, raising hopes of a breakthrough. However, after examination, the sheriff reported that the bones recovered were actually from animals. Undeterred, detectives collected ash samples and other material from the kiln and surrounding area for advanced testing. These samples were sent to laboratories for analysis to detect microscopic traces of human tissue. Once again, no definitive human remains were recovered from the kiln. Montz ultimately pleaded guilty to the substance manufacturing charges, which carried a potential 5-year prison sentence. Montz's sentencing was scheduled for June 12, 1995. Given Montz's status as the prime suspect in the Hare investigation, prosecutors argued he was a flight risk and even pushed for a $250,000 bail. However, the court allowed Montz a much lower bail of $20,000 and permitted him to remain free until sentencing under certain conditions. These were pretty standard. He had to surrender his passport, reside in the area, and check in with authorities daily. These precautions unfortunately proved insufficient, and on June 12, 1995, Montz never showed up for his sentencing hearing. For nearly 30 years, Jim Montz lived life on the lam, successfully evading capture. That changed in early 2025, when cold case detectives finally got the break they needed. While working the unsolved disappearance, Bonner County investigators and the Idaho State Police learned that Montz had been living under an assumed name in Georgia. Acting on this information, the U.S. Marshals Service, together with local authorities in Georgia, moved in and arrested Montz at a home in Thomasville. Investigators have questioned why he fled from what was ultimately to be a fairly short prison sentence, unless he suspected he was about to be charged with Hare's death. I hope to have an update on the disappearance of Michael Hare in a future episode. All that said, the authorities haven't yet charged Montz in relation to Hare's disappearance yet. Further, given that the informant gave his evidence over 30 years ago, I question what evidentiary issues the authorities will face in bringing charges at this point. Lisa Jane Borden was last seen by her family on October 10, 1979, in her hometown of Big Spring, Texas. Shortly afterward, the 19-year-old headed west to California on a solo hitchhiking trip. Notably, this wasn't uncommon or unusual at the time, and her family wasn't concerned. Later that month, Lisa phoned her relatives from Lodi, California, which would be the final contact anyone had with her. And just a quick note here, because I know many of you are probably thinking the same thing I thought. What was she even doing in California? Well, unfortunately, details on this case are quite sparse, and it isn't clear from publicly available information exactly what she was doing there. She had planned to return to Texas. Her boyfriend purchased a plane ticket for her trip home, to be picked up at the airport, but Lisa never arrived to claim it. After that last phone call, all communication from her ceased. She was officially reported missing by her sister when Lisa failed to come home and could not be located. The Big Spring Police Department in Texas took the lead in the case, in coordination with California authorities, given that was Lisa's last known location. Early on, information was scarce. One of Lisa's friends claimed that sometime after October 1979, Lisa was allegedly spotted in Amarillo, Texas, working as a waitress. This tip gave a glimmer of hope that perhaps Lisa was still alive and had chosen to stay away on her own. However, the friend provided no evidence or details to back up the story, and investigators were unable to confirm that Lisa was ever in Amarillo. Aside from that unverified account, no credible sightings or messages from Lisa ever surfaced after her disappearance. Despite the passage of time, there have been no breakthroughs in her case, and her case has gotten very little in the way of attention. What happened to Lisa remains completely unknown at present, with all theories being pure conjecture based on the extremely limited evidence. That said, given that she was in California during the 1970s, much of the online discussion on her case has focused on the potential that she fell victim to a serial predator. However, it's unclear if the authorities have ever seriously pursued this line of investigation. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin is among the most enduring and enigmatic legends of medieval Europe. It's said that in 1284, a mysterious stranger arrived in Hamelin, Germany, and used his magic pipe to first rid the town of rats. When the townspeople refused to pay him for his services, he then lured away the children from the town. While this legend has been told in stories and fairy tales, it also has a grounding in historical records that reference the sudden disappearance of Hamelin's children. Historically, the earliest known written reference to this event in Hamelin appears on a church window dating back to around 1300. This window reportedly depicted a piper leading a group of children out of the town. Unfortunately, this window was destroyed in 1660, and what we know of it comes only from older accounts. Other evidence includes a 14th century entry in the town's chronicles that reads, "It is 100 years since our children left," as well as references in various medieval manuscripts. Though these sources are fragmentary, they indicate that something significant indeed happened to Hamelin's children. The question that still dogs historians is simple: what actually took place? One popular theory, and arguably the one most tied to the fairy tale element, involves literal rat infestation. In the commonly told version of the story, rats invaded the town, causing destruction, disease, and panic. A colorfully dressed piper arrived, offered to get rid of the pests for a modest sum, and successfully led the rats to drown in a local river by playing his flute. When the townspeople refused to pay him, He sought revenge by doing the same with their children, leading them away, never to return. However, some historians point out that the earliest versions of the tale don't even mention rats, suggesting that the rat infestation may have been a later embellishment. This first mention of rats wasn't added in surviving texts until the 16th century, 3 centuries after the purported event. Now, of course, here I have to mention that this could just be survivorship bias in the source material. There may well have been earlier texts that mention the rats, but these texts may now be lost. It's also possible that the rat element was added to dramatize the story or give a moral lesson on keeping one's promises. After all, without the rat element, the lesson of keeping your word to those who assist you is completely lost, and instead it becomes a narrative about not trusting strangers or outsiders. Another explanation theorizes that the children's disappearance could have been tied to disease, particularly the plague. In the Middle Ages, outbreaks of plague were frequent, claiming countless lives and often displacing communities. Some historians argue that the children the piper took away might refer metaphorically to those who died, or those who fled Hamelin during an epidemic. In this theory, the Pied Piper is a symbolic figure representing death. While compelling, this interpretation doesn't perfectly account for the specificity of the date, 1284, or the details about a single event that removed only the town's children. A separate theory suggests that the children left Hamelin in a mass migration, or children's crusade. Historians note that during the Middle Ages, there were instances of large groups leaving their hometowns en masse in search of better opportunities or in response to religious fervor. The Pied Piper, in this interpretation, could be a recruiter or locator from Eastern Europe, beckoning laborers or colonists. Indeed, parts of Eastern Europe were being resettled en masse by Germans at that time, a process known as Ostsiedlung. If this were the case, the Piper might have been a charismatic figure who convinced young people to start new lives elsewhere. Over time, the legend may have turned him into a mystical figure who spirited them away. Yet another perspective links the disappearance of the children to a possible military campaign. During the period in question, territorial conflicts were common, and mercenaries sometimes passed through towns promising wealth or glory to eager youths. Some scholars suggest that children could refer not only to those who were minors, but to younger adults who chose to follow a recruiter onto a battlefield or into another region. Under this theory, they may have been involved in a mass casualty event on a battlefield somewhere, leading to an entire generation of Hamelin youth being wiped out. And to put things in perspective, the town only had about 2,500 inhabitants around the year 1700. Though we don't have data for Hamelin's population in the 13th century, it may have been substantially less. Under this theory, then, a generation of youth could be as little as a few dozen boys going off to war and being eliminated or simply never returning. The Brothers Grimm helped immortalize the Pied Piper story in their collection of German legends, first published in the early 19th century. Their retelling solidified many of the details that we associate with it today: the bright clothing, the magic pipe, and the tragic betrayal by the townspeople. While their rendition is by no means a faithful historical record, it did capture the essence of local lore and passed it on to wider audiences.